Hello and welcome to Surveyor Says, the podcast from the National Society of Professional Surveyors. Each week, we bring you fascinating guests that are involved in the profession of surveying. We cover a lot of ground, including Table A Talk with Gary Kent, Point of Order with the NSPS Joint Government Affairs Team, Future Focus, highlighting current and future leaders of the profession, and everything survey-related in between. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast, and hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Surveyor Says. Hello and welcome to another episode of Surveyor Says. This one's going to be a little unique because across from me is Curt. We're actually going to do something together rather than talking at each other for a time, because our special guest today is John J.B. Byrd, the Federal Lobbyist for NSPS. Rather than talk about the issues and the other stuff that he does for us, he's going to talk about himself, which is going to kill him because he doesn't like talking about himself. So we'll see how it goes. JB, how are you doing today?
I'm doing. I'm kind of. Tim, this has been an honor and privilege. I'm at the end of the week right now, and we've had a fun last couple days. So I'm running on reserves, but that's my job, and it's kind of, you'll see a pattern about this. So this is good for me. This is the toughest week of the year, quite frankly.
Sure.
And the good news is that you get buoyed at the end of the week because of all the good stuff that's going on. I've never been busier.
Good.
Quite frankly, Tim.
Good. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's just jump right into it. And that, who is John Byrd? What's your current position? I mean,
Sure.
the company and your position, and what do you do?
Sure.
Every day?
Well, Tim, number one, who am I? So I am a male. I'm 45 years old. I grew up in the Winchester, Virginia area, a small town called Berryville in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. And I grew up on an apple orchard / working farm, and that's how I got my start. So more of a rural upbringing. But I do remember my first summers working. I was 13, 14 in an apple orchard in Virginia humidity. And
Yep.
that I think it gave me a little blue-collar angle. And then I did go to undergrad, and I went to grad school, got an MBA. Fast forward to political experience and whatnot. How did I get my start, which is where I am now. I was doing the math on this, so Tim and Curt, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I graduated with an MBA from Winthrop University in 2001 in May, and then I started looking for a position. I didn't know what I was looking for, and I ended up on Capitol Hill roughly 5 months later, a month after 9/11, going to work for a U.S. Senate office. Fortunately, I was able to get my foot in the door, and I landed a position. That was my foot in the door experience. It was, again, a month after 9/11, and my third day working in the Senate office, in the front office especially, was the first day of anthrax.
Oh yes, I forgot about that. You
And
bet.
so that was very, very much an eye-opening experience, a little foreshadowing of what was to come later. As far as access to capital, that we have an issue now, and buildings being shut down. So you got exposed to public policy, working on the, instead of knocking on the door to get in, I was already in, on the other side of the door. And eventually I worked my way up to the point where I was in the scheduling department of the U.S. Senate office. That gave me exposure to who the heck wanted to come in and meet with a senator in the first place, and how did they go about doing it. And so that was tremendous exposure for me down the road that I could then use and still use to today. But who am I? What do I do now? So in 2004, I cycled off Capitol Hill. I got to work for a very small lobbying firm at that time based in Reston, Virginia, John Pelletier and Associates. That's who hired me to be a lobbyist. That was got started working, I guess, in January of 2005. So this is what my 16th year or so lobbying. But really, by October of this year will be my 20th year of being engaged in public policy, advocacy, or just in general being a part of the Hill experience.
Exactly. Okay. Good.
My current position is Vice President at Miller Wendhold Capital Strategies, based in Fairfax, Virginia. And John Pelletier's firm, roughly 2 years ago, started a acquisition merging with Miller Wendhold Capital Strategies, and that basically was finalized earlier this year, I believe January, early February. And so now, instead of having two firms in a merge, we are now a consolidated Miller Wendhold Capital Strategies, and I'm the vice president there.
Nice.
We have numerous clients that I do advocate and lobby for, but I believe we've been representing NSPS since 2012.
Exactly.
So the better part of a decade now.
Well, and we're not so naive to know that you do have other clients I guess that's been the nice thing, and that's one thing I want to compliment you on, is that you make us feel like we're your only client.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Oh,
you'd never
yes.
know it from our perspective that you worked for anybody else, just because of the availability, the capability, and getting things done for us timely, and it just seems to us like we're your only client, although we know you're not. I know one of the things I'm curious about. And part of it comes from my own background. You guys know, and probably most of our listeners know, my father was a minister. And so when I was growing up, I'm thinking, well, I'm probably not going to be that, because I've seen how that works and what you deal with and all those kind of things. And then later in life, I didn't become a minister, but I became an evangelist for surveying. So I'm just curious with you. I know your family background is steeped well, and you may want to talk about that a little bit in the whole political arena. And did that ever weigh on your mind as you were going through school or anything like that, or it just was an epiphany all at once?
I do. Thanks, Curt. It does take me down memory lane. Now that I think about it. So I won't get into the entire background, but I will say I do remember growing up when I was in the single digits age-wise. I do remember my grandfather coming over for family meals. At that time, he was a U.S. Senator before he announced his retirement in the U.S. Senate representing Virginia. And he would come over for dinner. We'd hear the latest about what happened earlier that, in some cases, that day or that month or whatever it was focused on. And we obviously looked up to him, and we were kind of we treated him just like any other member of the family, quite frankly. But he had some really good stories, and that really opened my eyes up. Yeah. I started listening more.
Right.
When you're around your grandparents, especially your grandmother, but then you start listening more to your grandfathers and whatnot. You just try to, at that point, you're very impressionable, and you're a little bit more open to hearing it, and you can tell. Theoretically, the kids know exactly who's fibbing and who's not.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Of course, and so that really was a really good impression for me. I was just treated like any other member of the family. I had 3 siblings, still do, fortunately, and we were always kind of fighting for attention. But especially when grandfather came over, everyone just kind of quieted a little bit.
Sure.
And it was more of a learning experience.
Well, I guess based upon that, and knowing that here's your grandfather, who's obviously a very prominent political figure, but yet you know him as just a grandfather. Does that help you give you a different perspective when you're dealing with some of the legislators, to know that they are just regular people in some instance? I mean, in most instances, they do have feelings.
Yes, the short answer is, in general, that should be the case. For me, it's whether I'm actually by myself with them, or if I have a client with me that I'm trying to, also represent. So when it's one-on-one, That comes a little bit more easily for me. But when I have another perspective in the room, I've got to weigh a couple other factors, and that actually gives me a couple more butterflies. That's where I'm a little bit more nervous, if you can believe that.
I don't, but that's okay.
And because it's not just me trying to connect with someone, it's me to connect with multiple at once. So it just takes a little juggling. But one-on-one, I feel pretty comfortable. The smaller the group setting, the more at home I feel.
So I want to talk a little bit more about those political relationships and the importance of whether it's a corporation, whether it's an association. Why is it so important, from your perspective, to have those political relationships? I mean, yes, we vote these legislators in. What makes it special that we need to be in front of them?
Well, from a surveying perspective, you look at the role of lobbying and what the Constitution allows, and who's at the table versus who's on the menu. The risk is, if you're not engaged in public policy and you're engaged in a profession and the profession is not represented, well, who's going to represent you? Who's going to speak for you? No one will, in a nice way. They're going to maybe potentially pick you apart or find a way to improve their background and at the expense of yours, quite frankly. So I think that's one of the major things that we try to focus on, is that we always hark back to the fact that politics is not a one-off situation. You're not just showing up to vote. It is a relationship with whoever you're voting for or want to engage in any which way. And so, we're just concluded the virtual day on the Hill from the last 2 days for the NSPS version in 2021. And there were a lot of folks who signed up for the first time. And what we try to coach them is that congratulations for stepping up, to representing the profession, to representing yourself, and making yourself look good, making the profession looking good. This is just a start. This is chapter 1.
Right.
And we want this to be a long story, a long book, a long relationship, if you have anything to do with it. And so they do. This is the first chapter. And the more chapters you can add to that relationship, the better off you are, the better off the profession is. And from a politician's point of view, they want to get something out of it too. And theoretically, there should be a good, mutually beneficial opportunity there for not just the constituent, but for the office holder.
Sure. Okay. That makes sense.
We had a conversation, the organization and you, but you, John, and I at one point had a conversation about our strategies this year and on how we were going to approach it differently than we have in the past. And now that we've gone through that exercise, do you have any thoughts about, it was great, successful, it didn't work so well, should we do it again? And you might even talk a little bit for the audience about what that strategy is.
Yeah, so there are two primary committees in NSPS that I interact with more frequently than others. The first is the Government Affairs Committee, and the second is the Political Action Committee. And quite frankly, there's a lot of overlap, not perfect overlap, but there's enough. And so what we try to do, Curt, as you alluded to at the start of every year, we try to get Pat Smith's Government Affairs Committee organized. And the four of us, there's John Pelletiello, who has been my longtime boss and is the government affairs consultant for NSPS. I'm there. Curt, you're obviously there, and then Pat's there. And we basically take a look at what happened the previous year, good and bad, and then, but primarily, what's the role of the Government Affairs Committee in developing policy? What does Congress look like? And when we decide for the NSPS Day on the Hill, or longer term, what are some of the other issues that we're going to need to be aware of and either be proactive or reactive to, we develop a pretty long list. And then we whittle it down a little bit, and then prioritize really what are the priorities and what should we spend most of our resources, primarily time, staff time, to pursuing. So it's a long process, but we think the benefits are done so that, in the short term, we can go up and educate members of Congress. But remember, Congress is a 2-year cycle. Mm-hmm. So every year we want to refresh that. And we usually do it in January. We're now in mid to late April. And boom, a third of the year is already behind us, so to speak. But there's plenty more to do as Congress picks up.
Do you think that the strategy I was kind of talking about before, do you think that our strategy this year where we had our participants talk to the legislators or their staffs more about who we are and what we do and why things are important to us, and typically we don't do that. We try to get people to talk about the issues, and sometimes we understand them and sometimes we don't. So I was just curious if you thought that worked or if it even manifested itself.
Yes, Curt. In context, this is really what happened. The decision was made not to take multiple issues to Capitol Hill, but to focus on one. And what that does as far as bandwidth is to get into that one issue way more actively, way more encompassing, and messaging. It made it a little simpler, but it also made it education-wise for the members. It was a little bit more simplified so that if you're starting off or if you're a veteran of doing these Hill days, it was, we thought, a better way to translate what the ask is. Mm-hmm. And in order to get to the ask, you got to do the background and the build-up. And that's where we thought that was the best way to leverage the profession and everyone's different perspective about what the profession means to them and how it would translate to the respective House and Senate offices. And we thought going with a more simplistic approach because of the virtual nature. We didn't know exactly what we're going to be getting in when we started the virtual angle, and we were still receiving good and bad, positive, negative feedback about that. But yeah, the goal was get our members engaged in a completely different way. Mm-hmm. But let's walk before we run. And that's what we consolidated down to one issue, but made it very concentrated, but in a helpful way, we thought. For instance, instead of having 3 different or 4 different issue papers, we just had one, but that one issue paper was 3 pages long. Mm-hmm. And so the way we scoped it out was the first roughly 2 pages was, what does society take for granted? Exactly. That should be attributed and can be attributed back to the profession. And then the last page was split into 2 items of the 3-page issue paper. The last page had, all right, what is the flavor of the day in Congress? And then that was to put it in perspective. So if you're a congressional staffer or a member of Congress, you could say, I'm interested in that, or I'm interested in all of these. But the point was that there was a target for something that made sense based on this year of the first year of the 2-year Congress. And the final part of the issue paper was, what is the ask and what's the flexibility to add a legislative provision? And so that gave our members, I think, some flexibility, but we thought it actually gave the members of Congress and their staff even more flexibility. Mm-hmm. So as our members made the ask, Leader Schumer, Senator Schumer, will you sponsor the NSPS provision in the Senate infrastructure bill? Right. Congressman Clyburn, as you're putting together your rural broadband infrastructure deployment bill, will you sponsor the NSPS provision in your rural broadband development infrastructure bill? I mean, so the build up to that was a lot, but the ask was very simple.
Right, exactly. I like the approach myself, I'll be honest with you, because, and I think Curt will chime in on here too, is that surveyors by nature, we have stories. We're storytellers. And so to be able to relate, like you just said, that first 2 pages is really that relationship that every one of those legislators and their staffs can understand. And then it does go into basically an ask of, this is how it applies to what your particular legislator is involved with. So I thought it was a great approach. So I kudos to the group for putting that together in that form. So I guess that gets me to my next question on lobbying itself. And there's a lot of I guess there's a lot of stigma behind lobbying, that it's greasing palms and it's doing quid pro quo and all these other things. Tell us in your terms. I mean, what is lobbying? Really, what it comes down to.
So my undergraduate degree, Tim, was in history,
Mm-hmm.
and my graduate degree was in business. And I saw common threads, and that was what were the historic trends connected to policy that impacted the business community and impacted the economy. In other words, what are the policies coming out of Washington, D.C. that impacts the marketplace, whether it's through legislation or if it's in an agency, what's the regulation? So lobbying, kind of a quick way to think about it, I think it has everything to do with doing your homework. What is the issue? What's either side of an issue? For me, with a history background, it required me to actually do research on any of the policies. What is our position? What is the opposition position? And then there's a combination. I think it's a combination of sales and also a combination of educating. And for me, if I'm starting from scratch with someone, I always say that I'm an interpreter. I represent a client, in this case, NSPS. Mm-hmm. They know exactly what they want. What's their target? Their target is Congress. Am I a middleman or someone who's kind of connecting the dots through communications, translation? Well, that's kind of an interpretation opportunity. So I'm an interpreter. I understand what the client wants. My job is then to effectively communicate it to a member of Congress. A lot of that has to mean educating myself, spending time with NSPS members and certainly leadership, understanding the policy, and then through a sales angle, finding out how to micro-target that message to every kind of office on Capitol Hill.
Right.
Whether they're on the far left, the far right, or somewhere in between. You got to micro-target the message based on the state, the Commonwealth, or if it's a congressional district, what makes the most sense to that congressional district. So there's a lot of research. There's a lot of educating yourself before you try to go over to the Hill and educate a member of Congress on why should they even give us the light of day, let alone do something about our ask.
Right.
So that's that. In short of it, my job is to be your voice, the client's voice. There are all sorts of ways to do it. Nowadays, it's mostly virtual. But when I got my start 16 years ago, it was literally shoe polish, going up to the Hill. The word lobbying came from, I think it was probably first disclosed in the movies through the movie Lincoln, where the word lobbying was literally people pigeonholing either the president, at that time President Lincoln, or members of the Senate and Congress. They were literally pigeonholed in lobbies outside their offices, sure. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't escape. They literally would lobby them. They would educate them. They would have a certain view that they were being hired to represent, and they would lobby them in a lobby. The most recent example of this coming up, I think, was one of the FCC commissioners, the Federal Communication Commissioners. I had a chance to, this is about a year ago when we still could do this in person on Capitol Hill. He was coming out of a briefing room on the House side in the Rayburn. If anyone's ever been in the Rayburn House office building, it's a pretty decent building. And some of the wings kind of connect all at once. And if you get a choke point, a pinch point, in one of those walking areas, you can literally pigeonhole someone in right along an elevator or a stairwell, and they have nowhere to go. Right. And so I was able to do that. We got a picture with Commissioner Carr, one of the current FCC commissioners, who has a very important role to play in the Legato GPS interference issue.
Sure.
So you can have all sorts of interpretations. That's up to everyone's view. I'm just trying to give you a context for how the name came about. But modern day lobbying, it can be done by the individual surveyor through the actual political process. It doesn't have to be someone who's a hired lobbyist. It can be, a constituent, an expert in your field that simply wants to educate and perhaps sell someone on the right way to do something that they think the status quo either doesn't work or it could work better. Yeah, and you want to lobby someone to either improve the status quo, maybe blow it up. But in general, change the status quo. That's what you're trying to do. And you've got to have an ask. You've got to be able to communicate that effectively. And you have to rely on the client to really get you up to speed on the issues specifically.
Sure. So it's important to know the dance, right?
And what kind of music's being played.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I want to take a little bit of a step back. Talking about, you talked about your start on the Hill.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people get completely blown away the first time we were on the Hill and lobbying, how young the staffers are, how young that the gatekeepers of getting into a lot of these legislators are. And that's a great thing. It really is. But I think that really shocks people, how young it is to get in there.
Yeah, good point, Tim. When I got my start, I was in my mid to late 20s, and I felt old. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I think there is the important thing is that these folks aren't just showing up just to show up. I mean, regardless of the age, anyone who works on Capitol Hill, whether they're an elected member of Congress or they're a key staff or just a staffer getting started, they have other intentions than just showing up for the job. Mm-hmm. They are driven, and they have policy in mind, and they literally, whether they're the brightest or the not so brightest, they have drive. Mm-hmm. And if you can make the connection with these folks and develop a relationship, that's something that can be incredibly helpful to the profession. And regardless of the opportunity, if you do not meet with a member of Congress, the staff around Capitol Hill literally run Congress. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows that members of Congress, they do take recesses. They go back to their districts. Guess who doesn't? Mm-hmm. The staff. The staff stay around and represent those offices and run Capitol Hill. And whether they're in their 50s, 40s, 30s, or 20s, or if they're interns, or even the pages that get their start as probably teenagers or whatever ages those are, there's definitely a matriculation in age, but do not be confused or misinformed or let down in any way. If you develop a relationship with these folks, they literally run Capitol Hill.
That's amazing.
So the trick is at your age or younger to be a peer, and if you're my age, you act grandfatherly, right?
I'd say that one of the cool things is that for the downside to the age in the staffers is that there's high level of turnover. Mm-hmm. Whether they want to go back to school, maybe pursue a grad degree, or they just want to do something else for whatever reason. So I look at it, it does come down to numbers and quality. So there is through the sales angle, if you go and visit 10 offices, in 3 years, there may be 3 or 4 of those original 10 offices that have the same staff. Mm-hmm. And after 10 years, maybe it's just one of those offices.
Sure.
But that's one 10-year relationship you have. And if you have 10 of those 10 out there, that means you've got 10 good contacts on Capitol Hill after a decade. And I've been at this now for 16 years, and you'd like to think that that is a good trail of folks that can be helpful. We go back to the earlier comment about we do have other clients. The good way to look at that, it's really happy to hear that y'all have that view of as far as feeling like you're our number one client. I will say this, what y'all get as well is that our clients who are other clients, we have relationships with those staffers, and we can then tap those resources as well to the benefit of NSPS.
Sure. Exactly.
So, there are a lot of different avenues that we can leverage our relationships on Capitol Hill, but they start with typically the young staffers that folks pass by every day.
I've always been curious because oftentimes a lot of the people you meet when you go in the office are the younger people, and sometimes you have a chance to talk to them a little bit, and you find that, at least in my experience, a good number of them actually come from the state where the legislator comes from. I'm just curious, as the those staffers mature and maybe start to move around a bit, do they still kind of stick to their own state, or they just go where the opportunities are, or how does that work?
They're a great question, Curt. The more I think about that, I'd say that there's no pattern. I think it just comes down to the individual. Some are very career driven. Some are very state driven. Some have a good mixture and have the best of both worlds. They get to work for a member of Congress from their home state, and it's perfect policy connection for them. But again, there's a high level of turnover for a reason, for many reasons, but one of which is just folks want to progress differently in their career, or change careers, or find a different rationale for their career, and they decide to switch for whatever reason. But yeah, if you can after knocking on so many doors, again, if you go with 10 offices, after 10 years, just one of those staffers is left, and they're in the same state representing the same office. Number one, most likely their boss, the member of Congress or senator, is going to be in an elevated position to help you, lobbying wise, but they're going to have 10 years of a track record. Hopefully, if you're still on their good side, that's a good thing, and you can leverage that relationship, and they can continue to leverage you as a resource.
Nice.
One of the things I've noticed too is, and I've always been curious about this, oftentimes when you're talking to the staffers, they seem to have some level of understanding of your issue or what you do for a living or all those kind of things, and obviously they do some kind of research to make that happen. But still, it makes you feel comfortable that they've taken the time to try to understand who you are and what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's cuts both ways, Curt. You gotta take an interest in these folks. I mean, they're going to take an interest in you. On the other hand, I will say this: I noticed in 16 years, I think where I saw a change was probably somewhere around year 7 or 8 of lobbying. After hustling for so long, and then again, as you start to see maybe 1 out of 10 staffers stick around after a decade, guess what starts to happen? You stop going to them. They start coming to you. And so there's a buildup, but it doesn't happen to every office, of course, that's where the relationships, it's probably again, I don't know the profession as well as the practitioners and professionals, but I would imagine it could be very similar as far as clientele, right? Yeah. You pursue clients, and then after a while, you stop pursuing them. They keep coming back to you.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. One thing that's very important in the surveying realm, we really keep going back to, is talking about mentors and how we're trying to progress the profession and such. What has mentoring been for you? I mean, obviously you didn't just jump into the Capitol and you just decided to wing it all the way through, and maybe you have, but have you had some good mentors along the way? People you've looked at, want to emulate, and have helped you along the way?
Well, it's maybe a shocking start to the conversation, but I learned how to answer this question back in high school. My mother and my father. Okay,
Yes.
So my father was the apple grower, and I remember during the harvest season, he may get 2 or 3 hours of sleep. One year, I think he got double pneumonia or double bronchitis, and that was the only thing that kept him in the house during the peak of the harvest season. But for at least 20 years, he was doing that. That showed hard work. That showed putting it all on the line for the family. My mom was a little different, but she had other responsibilities. And quite frankly, the most recent member of the family in politics was my mom. She literally served 20 years on the local board of supervisors in the county. And you'll love this. I mean, her first run for office was against an incumbent. She lost by 7 votes, and she decided not to seek a recount. And then that goodwill of not actually challenging the results of the election that close, the seat opened up 4 years later, open seat. She ran it walking away, and then she held the seat for another roughly 16 years after that first term, and then she retired recently. So those are the 2 mentors from the start. And then, obviously professionally, a lot of other folks I've looked up to. I got my start on Capitol Hill largely from my grandfather helping open a door for me, so I'll always be in debt for that. That's how I got my start. The original chief of staff of the Senate office is now running a major trade association downtown, so I'll always be helpful or thankful for that. As far as lobbying itself, though, of course, you can't go anywhere without mentioning John Pelletiello,
exactly.
Who hired me in late 2004 to start in 2005. I do remember, though, my first big coalition meeting on Capitol Hill was run by a coalition run by the Paul Miller of Miller Wenthold Capital Strategies. So I basically, as long as I've known John, maybe a month later I got to know Paul. And so eventually, 14 or 15 years later, their firms merged, and it's a good connection there. Curt, I'm trying to remember the first time we actually met. I think it was before we came on board in 2012. I'm thinking Cough Pace. So we probably got to know each other late 2005 or 2006, maybe back then.
Could have been easily.
So I was aware of Curt. I saw Curt maybe not as frequently, but Curt's been around the block and knows how Capitol Hill works.
Yep.
So I definitely reference Curt. Now, fast forward to 2012 when we first started, representing NSPS. A couple names come to bat. John Warren, Pat Beeler, Jim Cohn. A lot of folks not from the East Coast, and then a lot of folks from the Midwest, a lot of folks from the East Coast, and everywhere in between, quite frankly. There's probably obviously too many to name at this point. The closest relationships I have outside of the leadership here at NSPS, as part of leadership, is Pat Smith and John Warren. That's who I spend the most time communicating with. So within NSPS, that's where I have just an ongoing relationship, because there's been a lot of stability with those two committees, and that's been incredibly helpful. They work separately, but it's a team approach.
Exactly.
So I think one of the things that you can translate between working on Capitol Hill, working in an office versus lobbying, is these are not one-person operations. It does require a team. It requires coordination, and I've been very fortunate over the last 16 years to have great mentoring from John Pelletiello to Paul Miller to Curt and the entire, quite frankly, leadership of the profession that's kind of taken me in under the wings over the last 9 years.
Yeah, well, it's fit very nicely. So we'll wrap this up by asking, because I know I've got a couple of thoughts here, but you have a favorite political moment that just stands out? Anything stands out? Because actually there's been 3 different things that's happened with NSPS and in your interaction that stand out to me, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, Tim, I don't think we're on the same page on this. I can't read your mind, so I haven't given this too much thought. What I'm thinking is, whenever you get a bill enacted into law, that's a significant accomplishment, and we were able to get a couple of those. 2 bills specifically enacted in law that are just purely NSPS bills. One was the Digital Coast Act that authorizes the NOAA project into a codified program, and then the National Landslide Preparedness Act that authorizes 2 big opportunities for the surveying profession. One is the codification authorization of the 3D elevation program, and then something kind of relatively brand new that's a big deal for the profession, and that's the subsidence issue.
Yes.
And authorizing USGS to create a program and follow through with it. So those kind of things stick out. I will say this. Today, and for whatever reason, I've been talking way too much today. I did something I've never done before earlier today. It was kind of cool. We launched a congressional caucus, NSPS did, virtually. and with 2 members of Congress, 2 in a bipartisan manner, different sides of the aisle, 2 different parts of the country, bringing the country together on the creation of what we call the Construction Procurement Caucus. And given where the country is today with infrastructure debate, how much money is at stake, and how to best leverage the expertise of the profession, there's probably no better time for this kind of caucus to launch. So, and it's just literally fresh. It was like a few hours ago that we did this.
That's awesome. That is awesome.
I'm sure there's a third one, but again, I'm probably missing something blatantly.
Oh, no. See, no, that's what I like about it. You're thinking of the wins. You're thinking of the good, positive stuff. I'm thinking of the gyrocopter guy that landed in the next to the Capitol that cleared everybody out. We had one lobby day. We had the metro go down to where nobody could get anywhere.
Except for Ed O'Brien, who walked many times across the bridge from the hotel in Alexandria, Arlington to Capitol Hill.
Yep.
I think many times he did that on that one trip. Here's one. Speaking of there's nothing. So on Capitol Hill, when there's a committee hearing, the majority party takes much pride in scripting. Everything on Capitol happens for a reason. Mm-hmm. And it's scripted out most of the time, 99% of the time. The one time you can't plan for something is when technology hits and something snags. And this is probably about 5 years ago when the unmanned aerial system issue was being built up for the last FAA reauthorization bill. And every committee on the House side wanted a piece of the action, especially committees that don't typically have anything to do with the jurisdiction over the issue. They just like the technology, want to be cool. So I think I'm trying to think it was a Science, Space, and Technology Committee did a hearing. They brought in a witness who was in charge of flying an unmanned aerial system. And wouldn't you know it, they brought the system into the actual committee hearing room. And for those who may not be familiar, most of these rooms are very small. Mm-hmm. And there's very little wiggle room to elbow space. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as the UAS got up and flying inside the committee room, it crashed.
Oh, no, I haven't heard that story. That's
It
awesome.
crashed, and literally it took everyone by surprise. No one was hurt, fortunately. But truth be told, it painted a picture for what a lot of discussions of what was to come as far as safety, privacy, who should be an acceptable operator of these, and what's the role of government in regulating, what's the role of the market and commercial opportunities to move forward. And anyway, it allowed the members of Congress to see firsthand what can go right
So you're
and
saying
what can
maybe
go wrong.
You're saying maybe it wasn't an accident.
Maybe it was scripted.
Yes,
So
it could have been.
There are some other stories, but now that I understand the context, I could have gone a different way on some other examples.
Well, there again, I guess that speaks to the professional side and how much we appreciate what you represent for NSPS, because that's immediately what you gravitated to was the wins. You know, and here I am thinking of the funny stuff. I mean, the third thing I was thinking about was the one year we were there, congressional meeting. Mark Zuckerberg was there, so all of the journalism people were there, and it was a zoo, just an absolute zoo.
That actually was a success story for NSPS, and the rationale was during that exact hearing, I think it was 2018, maybe 2017
yes.
or 2018. The great folks in Oregon, PLSO, they had the opportunity to go and meet with the chairman of the full committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Nice.
Mr. Walden, when he was still in Congress, he chaired the committee, and he was responsible for bringing in Mr. Zuckerberg and doing that big hearing. It just so happened that PLSO and NSPS did a joint meeting with Mr. Walden, literally on the other side of the wall from the committee hearing room. And so the chairman would come out of the committee from talking with Facebook and all these other high-tech social media folks, and then learn about the surveying profession, about the role of technology, what was our ask, And that meeting was really cool because I think it was Bob Needhammer and Daryl Fuller had arranged a special kind of, it was a large group, maybe 7 or 8 NSPS members and associated friends coming in, and it made it quite an impression, but we kept on being pushed off by 15 or 30 minutes, but then the chairman showed up.
Oh, it was worth it.
He made us feel like we were the only ones in the room.
Nice.
Even though he had to had other fish to fry in the other room, so to speak.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, we appreciate you spending some time with us. Just so everybody else, so you know when you're listening to this, we just finished up an executive committee meeting, which JB anchored and came in and told us about some of the great stuff that's happened with the lobby day efforts, virtual lobby day efforts this year. So we appreciate all the time you've spent with us this afternoon, and we look forward to a few more wins that you keep chasing down for us, which will be really, really great. So,
I love the new technologies we have where we can do this no matter where we are, but nothing's ever as good as face-to-face like this.
yes.
This is just the best way to do it. It's a shame we can't do them all that way, but I know we can.
And that's a great way to segue off, I guess, because it's the same thing with politics. I mean, it's one thing to meet with someone online, but handshake, business card, eye to eye communication, body language,
everything.
And that's why you guys have done this, and a lot of other leadership and NSPS have done this, but the folks that have really put in the time and looked out for the profession have done this for years and years and years. And Tim, you're always up there. I always hark back to, this is probably a great segue off. Whenever we do a highlight list of what NSPS has accomplished, we always go back, especially recently, to the 2018 Farm Bill.
Sure.
We were able to get Brent Byrd appointed to the FCC USDA Advisory Commission task force on 5G, on rural connectivity issues, solely because one member of the NSPS leadership decided to go to a town hall meeting in Illinois one year and educate the chairman of the Committee of Jurisdiction, the House Agriculture Committee, and 5 or 6 other members of Congress who happened to be at that town hall meeting. Who the heck am I talking about? None other than Timothy Burch. So, Tim, thank you for your leadership and getting that ball rolling. It actually, that was probably in 2016 that you did that meeting, and the bill came out in 2018. So It did take a little while, but you laid out the red carpet for Congress to act. So that's exactly what we're hoping other NSPS members do. Keep opening doors up for others that follow.
It's about working together. That's it's what it's all about. So once again, JB, thank you for your time today. That this has been it's been a fun talk to get in. Not talking nuts and bolts on some things, but you know what? There's just, like I said, there's still for some parts of the public, there's still a stigma on what lobbying is about, and I can't think of a better person to be out in front of surveying for us on our behalf than you and John and your staff. That you guys
Absolutely.
have done a great job. So, well, that'll do it for us here on this episode. We've got a couple of great guests coming in the next few weeks. So stick around. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and we'll be talking to you soon. Thank you. You've been listening to the Surveyor Says podcast, brought to you by the National Society of Professional Surveyors. If you have any questions about today's episode or any other topic, please email us at info@nsps.us.com, and we are here to help. Visit our website, nsps.us.com, to learn more about our association, the programs we administer and support, our sustaining members, and information about future episodes of Surveyor Says. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, as well as our podcast host, Podbean. And remember, it's a great day to be a surveyor.